The ceremonial chalice trembled in Evelyn's hands as she raised the small silver pendant above the harvest wine, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Around the grand hall, 3 other young women mirrored her movement exactly, their identical pendants catching the flickering light of 100 lanterns. And when the wine began to bubble and hiss, as if recognizing something forbidden, the entire assembly froze in collective horror. She had arrived at Ravencrest Castle only hours before, her carriage wheels still echoing in her mind as they rolled across the cobblestones under a blood-red sunset. The marriage contract crinkled in her traveling bag, sealed with wax and promises she never made, binding her to a vampire lord she had never seen. But now, standing in this vast hall with its vaulted ceilings draped in midnight silk, watching the ceremonial wine react to her touch like liquid fire, Evelyn understood that her carefully planned life had shattered the moment she stepped through those ancient doors. The pendant burned against her palm, its crescent-shaped crack seeming to pulse with a life of its own. She had worn it since childhood, a gift from the village midwife who claimed it would protect her from nightmares. Now, as she stared at the 3 other women across the ceremonial circle, each clutching an identical piece of silver, each looking as stunned and terrified as she felt, Evelyn realized the nightmares were just beginning. "Impossible," whispered the ceremonial master, his candle wavering as if the very air had grown thick with secrets. The gathered nobles shifted restlessly, their pale faces stark against their dark formal attire, eyes glowing with that subtle luminescence that marked the vampire nobility. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like disturbed water, but Evelyn could barely hear them over the rushing of her own blood. Lord Damien Ashworth stood at the head of the hall, his imposing figure draped in midnight blue velvet, silver threading catching the candlelight like captured starfall. His dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing the sharp angles of his face and those piercing grey eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When their gazes met across the ceremonial space, Evelyn felt something shift deep in her chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with the marriage contract and everything to do with the way he looked at her, as if she were a puzzle he was desperate to solve. "The ritual must continue," Lord Damien said, his voice carrying easily through the hall despite its measured tone. There was something in his expression, a flicker of concern quickly masked, that made Evelyn's pulse quicken for entirely different reasons than fear. "Lower the pendants. We will address this coincidence after the proper ceremonies are complete." But as Evelyn moved to obey, her fingers brushing against the warm silver, a melody rose unbidden from her throat. Soft at first, barely more than a hummed breath, but when the other 3 women joined in without conscious thought, their voices weaving together in perfect harmony, the bronze bells in the tower above began to resonate in response. The sound that should have been sharp and repelling became something else entirely, something that wrapped around the assembled guests like silk. The bells fell silent. Complete, unnatural silence, where the protective chimes should have rung. "Guards!" Lord Damien commanded, but his voice held no anger, only urgent concern. "Check the perimeter, now!" Evelyn's breath caught as she realized what they had done. The bells were meant to protect the castle, to repel unwanted intruders, to maintain the ancient barriers that kept the vampire court safe from their enemies. And somehow, without meaning to, she and these 3 strangers had neutralized the very defenses that protected them all. The woman to her left, delicate and golden-haired like spun sunlight, began to tremble. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been singing that song my whole life. My governess taught it to me when I was small." "As did mine," said another, this one taller with auburn hair that gleamed like burnished copper in the candlelight. Her green eyes held a calculating gleam that made Evelyn uneasy, though I always wondered why she insisted I practice it every evening before sleep. The 4th woman, youngest of them all with dark curls framing her heart-shaped face, let out a nervous laugh that echoed strangely in the vast space. "Well, This is quite the wedding reception, isn't it? I do hope the feast is less explosive, but Evelyn barely heard them. Her attention was fixed on Lord Damien as he moved with fluid grace down the steps from his dais, approaching their small circle with the careful movements of a predator who wasn't sure if he was stalking prey or walking into a trap. When he stopped before her, close enough that she could catch his scent of cedar and winter air, she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Where did you learn that song?" His question was quiet, meant for her alone, but in the hushed hall, every word carried weight. I don't remember," she admitted, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's always been with me, like breathing or knowing my own name." Something flickered in his expression, too quick to interpret. "And the pendant? A gift from someone who said it would keep me safe." She lifted her chin, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Though I'm beginning to think safety was never really the point, was it?" Before he could answer, the massive doors at the far end of the hall burst open. A man in traveling clothes stumbled in, mud-splattered and breathless, his face pale with urgency. "My lord," he gasped, dropping to one knee. "Forgive the intrusion, but there are riders approaching from the east. They carry no banners, but their movements. They know the paths too well to be strangers." The assembled nobles rustled uneasily. Without the protective bells, the castle was vulnerable in ways it hadn't been for generations. Lord Damien's jaw tightened, and when he looked back at Evelyn, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not suspicion, but a kind of desperate hope. "The ceremony is postponed," he announced to the hall. "Until we understand what has happened here, no formal bonds will be sealed." His eyes found each of the four women in turn. "You will be my guests, not my prisoners. But you will remain within the castle walls until this matter is resolved." As the crowd began to disperse in anxious whispers, Lord Damien stepped closer to Evelyn. "There are things about your arrival that cannot be coincidence," he said quietly. "The same scribe wrote all 4 invitations. The same seal pressed all 4 letters, and now this." He gestured toward her pendant. "I need to know what game is being played here, and whether you are pieces on the board or players holding the dice." "I want answers as much as you do," Evelyn replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "But I won't be kept like a bird in a cage while you decide whether I'm friend or foe." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "I wouldn't dare try to cage something with claws as sharp as yours." The smile faded, but there are forces moving in the shadows that have waited decades for an opportunity like this. Until we know their intentions, your safety depends on my protection. "And what if I don't want your protection?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Born of years of having her choices made by others, her future decided by correspondence she never wrote. "Then you would be the first bride who ever told me so directly." This time his smile lingered. "I find I rather like it." Before she could respond, the housekeeper approached with swift, silent steps. Mrs. Blackthorne was a severe woman with steel-grey hair pulled back in an unforgiving bun, her dark dress immaculate despite the evening's chaos. But when her eyes fell on Evelyn's pendant, something shifted in her composed features. "My lord," she said carefully, "if I may suggest quarters for our guests." "Of course." Lord Damien nodded, but his attention remained on Evelyn. "See that they have everything they need. And Mrs. Blackthorne?" He paused. "They are to have access to each other. Whatever is happening here, separating them seems unwise." As the housekeeper led them toward the castle's residential wing, Evelyn fell into step beside the golden-haired woman who introduced herself as Serena with a tremulous smile. Behind them walked Isabella, the calculating redhead, and the dark-haired Helena, whose nervous humor seemed to mask something deeper. "Did any of you actually correspond with your intended?" Evelyn asked quietly as they climbed a spiraling stone staircase lit by flickering sconces. "Not once," Serena admitted. "Everything was arranged through intermediaries." "Same here," Isabella said thoughtfully, though I did try to research Lord Cassius before accepting. Found remarkably little information about him. Helena snorted softly. I couldn't even get a description of Lord Vincent beyond suitable and of good standing. Beginning to think we were all led here under false pretenses. Mrs. Blackthorn's steps faltered almost imperceptibly at Helena's words, but she continued walking without comment. Evelyn filed the reaction away for later consideration. In a castle full of secrets, even the servants' hesitations might hold meaning. The quarters they were given were luxurious beyond anything Evelyn had known in her village life. Silk hangings draped the windows, thick carpets covered the stone floors, and a fire crackled warmly in an ornate hearth. But what struck her most was the view from her window, the courtyard below where servants still bustled with activity despite the late hour. And beyond that, the dark line of forest that seemed to press against the castle walls like a living thing. There will be a light meal served in the common sitting room in an hour, Mrs. Blackthorn informed them. Lord Damien requests that you rest tonight, but tomorrow he would like to speak with each of you privately. She paused at the door, her hand on the ornate handle. A word of advice, if I may. The castle has its own rhythms, its own rules. Learn them quickly, and you will find your stay comfortable. After she left, the four women gathered in Evelyn's room by unspoken agreement. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as they sat in a loose circle, each clutching her pendant like a lifeline. What do you remember about getting these? Evelyn asked, holding up her piece of silver. Very little, Serena admitted. I was perhaps 6 years old. My governess said it was from my late grandmother, but when I asked her about it later, she claimed not to remember giving it to me at all. Isabella frowned. Mine came from the village wise woman. She said it was payment for a debt long overdue, but she wouldn't explain what the debt was for. The baker's wife gave me mine, Helena said. Said she'd been keeping it safe until I was old enough to understand its importance. But when I asked what that meant, she just smiled and changed the subject. Evelyn's throat tightened. Different people, different stories, but all of them women, all of them older, and all of them claimed it was for our protection. Protection from what? Serena whispered. Before anyone could answer, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Blackthorn entered, carrying a tray of tea and small cakes, her movements precise and measured. But as she set the tray on the small table near the fire, she spoke without looking at any of them directly. Sometimes protection requires separation, she said quietly. Sometimes it requires bringing together what was torn apart. She straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. The tea will help you sleep. Tomorrow will bring enough questions for all of you. As the door closed behind her, the four women exchanged glances heavy with unspoken understanding. They were pieces in a game they didn't understand, brought together by forces they couldn't name, their very presence threatening the ancient protections that kept this place safe. But as Evelyn sipped her tea and watched the firelight play across her pendant's crescent crack, she felt something she hadn't expected: determination. She had spent her entire life being told where to go and what to do, her future decided by others' correspondence. Not anymore. Whatever secrets this castle held, whatever game was being played with their lives, she would uncover the truth, even if that truth changed everything she thought she knew about herself. The fire settled lower in the grate as the night deepened, and somewhere in the distance she could have sworn she heard the faint echo of bells that should have been silent, calling out a melody that matched the song still humming in her blood. Dawn crept through the tall windows of Evelyn's chamber like a guilty secret, painting the stone walls in shades of pearl and amber. She had barely slept, her mind churning with questions that multiplied like shadows in candlelight. The pendant lay warm against her throat, and every time she touched it, she could swear she felt an answering pulse from somewhere else in the castle, as if the other three pieces were calling to hers. A soft knock interrupted her restless thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Blackthorn with breakfast. Instead, Lord Damien himself stepped through the doorway, and Evelyn's breath caught at the sight of him in the morning light. Gone was the formal velvet of the previous evening, replaced by simple dark clothing that somehow made him seem more dangerous, more real. "Forgive the early intrusion," he said, his voice carrying that same measured control she was beginning to recognize as his defense against chaos. "But there are developments you need to know about." Evelyn pulled her robe tighter around herself, acutely aware that her hair hung loose around her shoulders and that she was hardly dressed for receiving a vampire lord. "What kind of developments?" "The riders from last night." His grey eyes were troubled. "They carried a message. It seems our situation has not gone unnoticed by the other courts." "What does that mean for us?" "It means," he said, moving to the window and gazing out at the courtyard below, "that we have perhaps a fortnight before representatives from the Eastern courts arrive to investigate what they're calling a breach of the ancient accords. They believe the silencing of our bells was deliberate sabotage." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "And if they decide we're guilty, then the marriage contracts become the least of our concerns." He turned back to her, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Not fear, but a kind of fierce protectiveness. "Which is why I need you to trust me enough to tell me everything you remember about your childhood. Every detail, no matter how small. Why should I trust you?" The question came out sharper than she intended, born of a lifetime of learning that men in power rarely had her best interests at heart. Instead of anger, something that might have been admiration flickered across his features. "Because I'm asking instead of commanding. Because I could have had you confined to the tower last night and didn't. And because," he paused, moving closer until she could see the silver flecks in his grey eyes, "I suspect we're both pawns in someone else's game, and I'd rather we face it together than apart." There was something in his voice, a vulnerability carefully controlled, that made her defenses waver. "What do you remember about your own childhood?" she challenged. "Very little before the age of 10, he admitted, "which is strange for our kind. Vampire children typically have perfect recall from the age of 5 onward." He ran a hand through his dark hair, disheveling it slightly. "There are gaps in my memory that I've never been able to explain. Fragments of a song I can't quite recall. The scent of honey cakes, the sound of children laughing in rooms that I know were always empty." Evelyn's heart began to race. "Honey cakes? You know that scent?" She started, then stopped, overwhelmed by a sudden rush of memory. A warm kitchen, the smell of baking bread, hands teaching her to braid dough while a familiar melody hummed in the background. "I think I do, but it doesn't make sense. I was raised by the village seamstress after my parents died. There was never a proper kitchen, never time for luxury like honey cakes." Before either of them could say more, urgent footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Mrs. Blackthorne appeared in the doorway, her usually composed face flushed with exertion. "My lord," she said breathlessly, "you need to come to the archive immediately and bring Miss Evelyn." "What's happened?" "The scribe, the one who wrote the marriage contracts. He's returned, and he's asking for sanctuary. Says he has information about the pendants that could save us all." They found the scribe in the castle's main archive, a vast room lined with leather-bound volumes and scrolls that seemed to stretch up into the shadows above. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that darted nervously between the assembled group. Serena, Isabella, and Helena were already there, their faces pale with apprehension. "Tell them what you told me," Mrs. Blackthorne instructed. The scribe wrung his hands, leaving dark smudges on his worn clothing. 20 years ago, I was commissioned to write a series of documents. Not just the marriage contracts you've seen, but others. Separation papers, adoption records, bills of sale for properties in distant villages. He looked up at Lord Damien with haunted eyes. "I was paid very well to ensure that certain dates were never recorded, certain connections never made." What connections? Lord Damien's voice was deadly quiet. 4 children, the scribe whispered, born on the same night during a lunar eclipse, taken from their family and placed in separate villages with instructions that they were never to be told of each other's existence. He reached into his traveling bag with shaking hands and withdrew a piece of faded cloth. This was left as payment. I kept it all these years, thinking it might be valuable. Evelyn gasped. The cloth bore an embroidered design of 4 crescent moons arranged in a circle, each one slightly different, but clearly part of a whole. At the center was a symbol she had seen before, carved into the stone above the castle's main entrance. The Ashworth family crest, Lord Damien breathed, but that's impossible. My family has no record of children born that year. Because, Mrs. Blackthorne said quietly, stepping forward with her hands clasped tightly before her, those records were destroyed. On the orders of your father's council, who believed that children born during an eclipse under the sign of the divided moon would bring either salvation or destruction to the vampire courts. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of revelation. Evelyn felt the world tilt around her as pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving began to fall into place. You're saying we're sisters? Helena's voice was barely a whisper. Half-sisters, Mrs. Blackthorne corrected. Born of the same mother, but your father, she looked directly at Lord Damien, was not entirely vampire. The union was forbidden, the children considered abominations by some, miracles by others. Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. So we were torn apart as infants and scattered like seeds, only to be gathered back here 20 years later for what? Some cosmic joke? Not a joke, said a new voice from the archive entrance. They all turned to see an elderly woman leaning heavily on a walking stick, her white hair braided with silver threads that caught the light like captured starfall. A prophecy. Mrs. Blackthorne bowed deeply. Elder Morgana, I didn't know you had arrived. I came as soon as I heard about the bells. The old woman's eyes, sharp as winter sky, moved from face to face before settling on Evelyn. You have your mother's chin, child. Stubborn to the bone. You knew our mother, Serena asked, tears threatening in her voice. I delivered you all on that eclipse night. 4 daughters born within the hour, each gifted with a voice that could harmonize with the ancient magics. Elder Morgana moved slowly into the room, her stick tapping against the stone floor. Your mother died bringing you into the world, and your father, well, he was forced to choose between his children and his throne. He chose the throne, Evelyn said flatly, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. He chose to let you live, Elder Morgana corrected. The council wanted you destroyed. He convinced them instead to separate you, hoping that distance would weaken whatever power you carried. She smiled sadly. But blood calls to blood, and magic recognizes its own. The pendants were made from your mother's jewelry, each one carrying a fragment of her last song. Lord Damien stepped forward, his face pale but determined. If they're my half-sisters, then the marriage contracts are invalid, Elder Morgana confirmed. Which was always the point. Someone wanted you all gathered here for reasons that have nothing to do with marriage alliances. But who? Isabella demanded. Who benefits from bringing us together? That, said a cold voice from the shadows behind the archive shelves, would be me. A figure emerged from the darkness between the tall bookcases, and Evelyn's blood ran cold. The man was tall and pale, with silver hair that seemed to glow with its own light, and eyes like chips of ice. Power radiated from him in waves that made the air itself feel heavy and oppressive. Lord Malachar, Lord Damien said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. What are you doing here? Collecting what belongs to me, the intruder replied smoothly. These 4 lovely creatures represent something very valuable indeed. A weapon that could tip the balance of power between the courts permanently. They're not weapons, Lord Damien snarled, moving protectively in front of Evelyn. They're people. They're half-breeds with the power to neutralize our most ancient defenses, Lord Malakar corrected. In the right hands, they could make any court vulnerable to attack. In my hands, they could make me unstoppable. Evelyn felt fury rise in her chest like a tide of flame. We're not going anywhere with you. Oh, but you are. Lord Malakar smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. You see, I have something that might change your mind. He gestured, and two figures stepped out of the shadows behind him. Mrs. Blackthorne gasped. Thomas? Sarah? The two people being held by Lord Malakar's guards were clearly villagers, their rough clothing and calloused hands marking them as common folk. But their eyes held a desperate love as they looked at the four women. The baker's wife who gave you your pendant, Helena, Lord Malakar said conversationally. And the blacksmith who helped raise young Isabella. I have similar leverage for all of you. Come with me willingly, and they live. Refuse. He shrugged elegantly. You bastard, Isabella spat, her green eyes blazing with fury. Careful, my dear, that's no way to speak to your new patron. But before anyone could respond, Evelyn stepped forward, her pendant growing warm against her throat. What if we refuse? She asked quietly. What if we choose to fight instead? With what? 4 untrained girls and a vampire lord who's outnumbered 10 to 1? Lord Malakar gestured again, and more figures emerged from the shadows. I think not. That's when Evelyn felt it. A pulling sensation, as if invisible threads connected her to her 3 sisters. Without conscious thought, she began to hum the melody that had been living in her blood since birth. Serena joined her first, then Helena, then Isabella, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer. The effect was immediate. The bronze elements in the archive began to resonate, but instead of repelling, they seemed to amplify the girls' voices. The sound grew, spreading through the castle like ripples in a pond, and everywhere it touched, Evelyn could feel the ancient protective magics responding, strengthening. Lord Malakar's confident expression faltered. Impossible. The bells are silent. The bells, Elder Morgana said with satisfaction, were never the source of the power. They were simply the focus. But family is a much stronger foundation than bronze. The archive doors burst open as castle guards poured in, their weapons drawn. But they weren't facing Lord Malakar's forces. They were facing an empty room, save for 2 unconscious guards and a hastily scrawled note. He's gone, Lord Damien said grimly, reading the message. But this isn't over. He'll be back with a larger force. Evelyn let the song fade, feeling drained but oddly exhilarated. Then we need to be ready for him. We? Lord Damien raised an eyebrow. Did you think discovering we're related would make us run away? Helena asked with a grin that was part nervous energy, part genuine amusement. This is the most excitement any of us have had in years. Besides, Serena added quietly, we have people to protect now. Those villagers who helped raise us, the castle folk who've shown us kindness. We can't just abandon them. Isabella nodded firmly. And I, for one, am tired of being someone else's pawn. If Lord Malakar wants a fight, he'll get one. Elder Morgana chuckled, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Your mother would be proud. She had the same fire in her eyes when she chose love over safety. Evelyn looked at Lord Damien, seeing her own determination reflected in his grey eyes. So, what's our next move? We prepare, he said simply. We learn to use your combined power properly. We fortify the castle, and we send word to the other courts that Lord Malakar has declared war on the ancient Accords. He paused, studying her face. But first, we need to understand exactly what you 4 are capable of together. As if in response to his words, the 4 pendants began to glow with a soft, silver light, their crescent shapes seeming to reach toward each other across the space between the sisters. Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. Whatever came next, whatever battles they would face, she wouldn't face them alone. She had found her family at last, in the most unlikely of places, and she would do whatever it took to protect them, even if it meant learning to wield a power that could reshape the very foundations of their world. The archive fell quiet, except for the soft whisper of turning pages as Elder Morgana began searching through the ancient texts, looking for answers to questions they were only beginning to understand. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Lord Malakar's retreat was only the calm before a much deadlier storm. 3 days of preparation had transformed Ravencrest Castle from a place of elegant formality into a fortress bristling with desperate energy. Evelyn stood at the highest tower window, watching the sun set behind storm clouds that had been gathering since Lord Malakar's retreat, and wondered if this would be her last sunset. Below in the courtyard, servants rushed to reinforce barricades, while vampire guards took positions along the ramparts, their pale faces grim with the knowledge that their ancient protections had been compromised. Second thoughts? Lord Damien's voice came from behind her, soft and understanding. She didn't turn around, afraid that if she looked at him, her carefully constructed resolve might crumble. About which part? Discovering I'm half vampire royalty, learning I have 3 sisters I never knew existed, or preparing to face a madman who wants to use us as weapons? About trusting me. His footsteps approached until she could feel the warmth of his presence at her back. About staying when you could have run. Now she did turn, finding his grey eyes dark with something that made her heart race. Where would I run to? This is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged, even knowing what that belonging might cost you. Evelyn reached up, her fingers brushing the silver pendant at her throat. Especially knowing that. I've spent my whole life being safe, Damien. Being careful, being what other people needed me to be. She stepped closer, close enough to see the silver flecks in his eyes, the way his breath caught when she used his name without his title. I don't want to be safe anymore. I want to choose. And what do you choose? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Evelyn felt the weight of all the decisions she had never been allowed to make pressing down on her shoulders. But when she looked at him, when she saw the way he waited for her answer without trying to influence it, the weight lifted. I choose to fight, she said simply. I choose my sisters. I choose this castle and the people in it. She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. And I choose you, not because of some marriage contract written by strangers, but because I want to. Something blazed in his expression, fierce and tender at once. Evelyn, my lord! The urgent shout from the courtyard below cut through whatever he had been about to say. They're coming! They rushed to the tower's edge, and Evelyn's blood turned to ice at what she saw. Lord Malakar's forces approached like a dark tide across the valley, their numbers far greater than the small army that had retreated 3 days before. Banners flew from dozens of carriages, and the very air seemed to shimmer with dark magic. How many? Damien called down to the guard. At least 200, my lord, and they have siege engines. Evelyn felt her sister's presence before she saw them. Serena, Isabella, and Helena climbed the tower stairs with Elder Morgana close behind, their faces pale but determined. Each wore her pendant openly now, the silver crescents catching the dying light like small moons. It's time, Elder Morgana said simply. The castle's defenses won't hold against that force, not without the bells. But you four... She smiled, and for the first time since Evelyn had met her, the old woman looked hopeful. You four might be able to do something that hasn't been done for 3 centuries. What? Helena asked, nervousness making her voice higher than usual. Sing the castle itself awake. Isabella frowned. What does that mean? Ravencrest wasn't just built on this hill, Elder Morgana explained, moving to an ancient tapestry that covered one wall of the tower. She pulled it aside, revealing a carving in the stone that made Evelyn gasp. 4 crescents arranged around a larger circle, with intricate patterns flowing between them like musical notation carved in rock. It was grown from it. The original builders were earth singers, and they wove their magic into every stone, every beam, every breath of mortar, but the songs to wake that magic were lost when your mother died. Lost, Serena whispered. Not lost, Damien said quietly, understanding dawning in his voice. Hidden, in the lullaby you all remember, in the melody that silenced the bells. Evelyn stared at the carving, and something deep in her memory stirred. Not just the tune she had always known, but words to go with it. Old words in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. I can feel it, she said wonderingly. The song. It's like it's been waiting. Then we'd better not keep it waiting much longer, Isabella said grimly, pointing toward the approaching army. Because they'll be at the gates in minutes. They descended to the great hall, where the ceremony had begun just 3 days before. But now the space served a different purpose. The furniture had been cleared away, and symbols had been chalked on the floor in precise patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Mrs. Blackthorne waited with a small group of the castle's human servants, their faces frightened but resolute. Whatever happens, Damien said, taking Evelyn's hands in his, know that this was my choice too. All of it. You. This fight. This moment. Before she could respond, the castle shook with the impact of the first catapult stone against the outer walls. Through the great windows, they could see Lord Malakar's forces spreading across the courtyard like spilled ink, and the sound of breaking stone echoed through the halls. Now, Elder Morgana commanded, before they breach the inner defenses. The four sisters joined hands in the center of the chalked circle, their pendants beginning to glow with increasing intensity. Evelyn felt the melody rise from someplace deeper than memory, and when she began to sing, the words that came from her throat were in the old tongue, the language of stone and earth and growing things. Serena's voice joined hers in perfect harmony, then Helena's, then Isabella's, and as their voices wove together, the very foundations of the castle began to respond. The carved symbols on the walls started to shine with golden light, and the floor beneath their feet hummed with awakening power. But Lord Malakar was no fool. Even as the castle's ancient defenses stirred to life, his own voice rang out across the courtyard, dark magic weaving through his words like poison through water. The golden light flickered, and Evelyn felt their song waver under the assault of his counterspell. "He's too strong," Isabella gasped, sweat beading on her forehead from the effort of maintaining her part of the harmony. "No," Evelyn said fiercely, remembering every moment of her life when she'd been told she was too weak, too small, too insignificant to matter. "We're stronger. Together, we're stronger than anything he can throw at us." She poured every ounce of her will into the song and felt her sisters do the same. Their voices soared higher, the harmony becoming something more than music, more than magic. It became the sound of family choosing to fight for each other, of love refusing to bow to fear. The castle responded like a living thing awakening from a long sleep. The stones themselves began to sing, their voices joining the harmony in notes too deep for human ears, but felt in the bones of everyone present. The walls strengthened, the towers straightened, and from every carved symbol came streams of golden light that wove themselves into a barrier of pure protective magic. Lord Malakar's army struck that barrier and recoiled like waves breaking against a cliff. His siege engines shattered against walls that had become harder than diamond, and his soldiers found themselves unable to advance through light that burned them without flame. But the effort was costing the sisters dearly. Serena swayed on her feet, her golden hair dark with sweat, and Helena's voice was becoming strained. Even Isabella, always the strongest, showed signs of flagging. "We can't keep this up much longer," she warned through gritted teeth. That's when Lord Malakar himself appeared in the great hall, his form wreathed in shadows that seemed to devour light. "Enough," he snarled, his voice carrying a compulsion that made Evelyn's knees buckle. You will stop this display and come with me willingly, or I will tear this castle down stone by stone with everyone you care about inside it." "Never," Evelyn said, but her voice was weaker now, the song faltering. "Then you force my hand." Lord Malakar raised his arms, and darkness began to pour from him like smoke, reaching for the circle of light that protected the singing sisters. That's when Damien stepped between them, his own power flaring to life around him like silver fire. "You want them?" he said, his voice deadly calm. "You'll have to go through me first." The two vampire lords clashed in the center of the hall, power against power, light against shadow. But Lord Malakar was older, stronger, and Damien was quickly being overwhelmed. Evelyn watched the man she loved being driven to his knees by the creature who wanted to enslave her and her sisters, and something inside her snapped. The careful control she had maintained her entire life shattered like glass, and her voice rose in a note that made the very air ring like a bell. Her sisters felt the change and responded instantly, their own voices soaring to match hers. But this wasn't the song of awakening anymore. This was something else entirely, something that had never been sung before. It was the sound of four hearts choosing love over fear, family over safety, freedom over survival. The hall filled with light so brilliant that everyone present had to shield their eyes. When it faded, Lord Malakar was gone. His darkness burned away as if it had never existed. His army in the courtyard milled in confusion, their master's compulsions broken, before fleeing into the night like shadows at dawn. Evelyn fell to her knees, completely drained, but strong arms caught her before she could hit the stone floor. Damien pulled her against his chest, and she could feel his heart racing as fast as her own. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "He's gone. Really gone this time." Around them, the castle continued to sing softly, the stones themselves humming with contentment, like a cat purring in the sun. The golden light had settled into the walls permanently, making every surface glow with gentle warmth. "The castle will never be vulnerable again," Elder Morgana said with satisfaction, "and neither will any of you. What you've done here tonight has changed the very nature of the magic that protects this place." Serena, Helena, and Isabella gathered around Evelyn, their faces exhausted but radiant with joy. "So what happens now?" Serena asked. "Do we stay? Do we go? Do we pretend to be normal people again?" "I don't think we could pretend to be normal if we tried," Helena laughed, the sound bright with relief and newfound freedom. "Besides," Isabella added with a grin, "I rather like being supernatural royalty. It has a nice ring to it." Evelyn looked up at Damien, seeing her own future reflected in his eyes. "I know what I want," she said. "I want to stay here with all of you. I want to learn what it means to be part of a family. I want to help govern this castle and protect the people in it." She paused, her heart full to bursting. "And I want to marry you, Damien Ashworth, not because of any contract or political alliance, but because I choose you." His smile was brilliant enough to rival the castle's new glow. "Then marry me you shall. But first..." He stood, pulling her up with him, and turned to address the assembled group. "First, I think we have some celebrating to do. Mrs. Blackthorn, break out the good wine. Tonight we feast not for a political alliance, but for family found and love freely chosen." As the servants bustled to prepare an impromptu celebration, Evelyn stood surrounded by her sisters, wrapped in the arms of the man she loved, in a castle that sang with magic and contentment. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. The pendant at her throat pulsed gently, its crescent shape complete now that it had found its purpose. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing stars that shone down on Ravencrest Castle like blessings from above. In the months that followed, Evelyn would learn to use her voice not just as a weapon, but as a tool of healing and protection. She and her sisters would become known throughout the vampire courts as the Harmony Guard, protectors of the innocent and defenders of the ancient accords. and she would marry Damien in a ceremony where the bells rang with joy instead of warning, where the castle itself seemed to celebrate their union. But all of that was still to come. Tonight, there was only this moment, this perfect crystalline instant where everything that had been broken was finally whole again. Evelyn closed her eyes and listened to the soft singing of the stones, the gentle laughter of her sisters, the steady heartbeat of the man who held her close. She had found her song at last, and it was more beautiful than any melody she could have imagined. It was the sound of home, of family, of love, freely given and joyfully received. And as the castle settled into peaceful slumber around them, Evelyn knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of her story. The best was yet to come.